Good evening, everyone. Yalimada, and welcome to the first UK Global Encounters virtual workshop. My name is Feroza, and I will be hosting this evening's photography workshop with Naveed Osman. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Naveed Osman. I have known Naveed for many years, as we both attend North London Jamaat Khana. Growing up, I have many memories of Naveed with a camera in hand at various Jamaati social events. Naveed has been taking photos since his teens, and over the years, his interest in photography has gravitated towards environmental photography, encompassing wildlife and landscapes. In 2018, Naveed presented some photos of Maasai ladies in the Jubilee Arts Art Gallery, which were exhibited in Lisbon. I've recently caught a glimpse of the truly incredible scenes that he has captured through his lens. And I'm so excited for Naveed to share all of that with you today, and also to explore some editing techniques. So without further ado, over to you, Naveed.
Hi, Yalimada, everybody who's watching. You may already be aware that the underlying theme for this year is care. And the photographs that I've chosen tend to reflect care throughout the compilation that I have. Care for ourselves, care for our community, care for our environment. And the environment, I think, is probably the most significant factor that is affecting the world. Wildlife, landscapes, humanity. So when you start to take photographs, please keep those themes in mind. And they're open to interpretation. There's nothing is set in stone. And when you do present those, it would be nice that you have taken those into consideration. What I will do is I'll start the slideshow so you can have a look and it'll give you some sort of idea. Now, not all the photographs have been taken with some fancy camera. You'll find that there are 4 photos in this slideshow, and you'll be able to distinguish them because they're slightly smaller on the screen, and they were all taken with a smartphone. They've not been edited, they've just come straight out of a smartphone. So if you don't have a fancy camera, you can still produce some really nice images in the way that the technology has moved on with these cameras. So I won't carry on, I'll just bring this up and hopefully you can get some inspiration from this. Okay, so with some of those photographs, what I'll do is I've got a few photographs I've just selected, and it might be worthwhile showing people how one that's come straight out of a camera can be edited afterwards.
Maybe just before you start, I think we have a question from Jamil Teja.
Yes,
Hi, Navid. It was great photographs.
thank you.
There's two things that come to mind. One, you've got brilliant compositions, and secondly, the technical side of this. Was this all done on automatic exposure, or did you set the exposures?
No. So I don't use automatic at all, because you'll find that if you set your camera to automatic, it's going to do what it wants to do. So I will go into that. Every photograph that I take is completely manual. So I will set the exposure by setting a certain shutter speed. I will set a certain aperture. And then those that are familiar with the digital cameras, you have what's called the ISO setting, which determines how sensitive your sensor is for a given amount of light. So perhaps before I start editing these photographs, it might be worthwhile just quickly going over that. So every exposure that is taken has to be determined by how much light you have to play with. So if you have a lot of light, you don't necessarily need to set your shutter speed at a low number. So the best way I can describe this is if you imagine a set of doors, and on one side of the doors you have light, and on the other side of the doors, the light needs to get into this theoretical room, this hypothetical room. So if you open the door very slightly, only a certain amount of light's going to get in. And if you close that door very quickly, you're going to get even less light getting in. So the analogy with the door is the actual shutter. The shutter is what opens and closes, allowing the light to hit your sensor. In the olden days, it used to be film at the back of the camera. So the faster your shutter speed is, the less light is going to get in for any given amount of sensitivity. I know this sounds a bit complicated. Similarly, if you open up your lens, because the lens will open and close depending on how much light you'd like to allow in. And this is the analogy with the door. How wide do you open the door? So if you open the door very, very wide, and you've got a set amount of light on the other side, well, much more of that light's going to get in. So, for example, the photos you saw right at the end, which were of the Milky Way, with me standing looking up at it, on something like a 20-second exposure, which means that the camera had to be on a tripod, so there was no movement. The aperture setting was 2.8. Now, the smaller the number, the larger is the opening. It's an inverse method of describing it. So if you've got a setting on your lens, which is say 11, that lens is going to be closed down. It'll be very narrow. So obviously, if you take a shot of the night sky, you're going to have that open for a long, long time. And the problem then is the Earth is rotating. So instead of seeing the stars as sharp points, you end up getting trails. So again, just going back to that one picture, I think it was around the 20-second exposure. The sensitivity setting would probably have been around 3,200, whereas in the daytime, your setting would probably be 100 to 200. So this is where it varies depending on how much light you have. And then the lens was open to its maximum, which was 2.8. So any exposure is a combination of your shutter speed, your lens opening, and the sensitivity on your camera, on a digital camera. Now, if you set everything to automatic, it'll do it by itself. However, it's very difficult to record the night sky on a completely automatic setting. Most of the other ones that I've taken, particularly landscapes, well, nothing is moving. So you can quite easily take automatic photographs. The problem then is the camera is going to try and average out the light. And therefore you get dark spots. And sometimes if you're taking a picture of a mountain, for example, in a valley, well, it's quite dark down there. So the camera will pick that up. But that means the sky will be completely blown out. You won't be able to see it. So one of the photographs which I've taken straight out of the camera is one of a landscape, and I'll develop that for you. Similarly, the photographs you saw of the birds, the puffins. Now those were taken at something like 1/2000, 1/3000th of a second, because they're flying very, very fast. If you let your camera do that on an automatic setting, it's not going to pick it up because the shutter speed will be too slow. Because what the automatic setting does, it averages everything out. You then have to go back and put these pictures on your computer, and using a variety of software, just manipulate them to get your best result. It's a long answer, but I hope that sort of answers your question a little bit. And the photograph of the Milky Way in its entirety, that was 16 photographs were taken, panning from one end of the Milky Way to the other, and then they were all stitched together to give one big panoramic view. So that single photograph is probably about 50 megabytes in size, whereas the panorama was about 250 megabytes. So it took about 10 minutes for the computer to actually process it. And this again highlights the principle that you can't do a lot of this work automatic. But then, it's an interest that I have, so I'm happy to spend the time doing it. Okay. Hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, it answers my question. I mean, you touched on the two things that I had in mind. Was one the long exposure for the night photography, and the second was the puffin with the fish in its mouth flying towards you.
Yes,
I mean, both at the completely different ends of the spectrum. So yes. Presumably, with the puffin one, you knew what you wanted to capture. You had the camera set, and you were just praying for a puffin to fly past.
No, so what was happening is, I'm tracking. So where they're flying. They're very, very fast, and they're actually quite small. That photograph that you saw of the puffin in the sky with the silhouette of a seagull in the background, well, that seagull was trying to rob that puffin of the fish, and I was hoping to catch that, but it didn't happen. And the irony also is, I took that photograph from a boat. I was there's a place called Skomer Island off the Welsh coast. And these puffins were flying out, and I just took some pictures, and that puffin was actually completely silhouetted against the bright sky. But when I went back and put it onto the computer, I realized I could recover the dark shadows in the software, and it actually came out really quite nice. It was a bit of a fluky photograph, I have to be honest, but it did come out really, really well. And this is the other thing about photography, particularly wildlife. You can plan and plan and plan and get nothing. And then out of the blue, one split second, and you'll end up with a really nice photograph. Whereas if you're doing landscapes, you can go and sit there until you're happy with the picture and then go home.
Yeah, thanks very much, Naveed.
Thank you, Naveed. We've had another couple of questions come through on the chat, if you're happy to take them now.
Yeah, sure.
One of them is, which settings would you suggest to capture the night sky and stars on Pro mode on a smartphone whilst I wait to purchase a camera?
Okay, so I think the newer smartphones, they can do it, because I think we were in Iceland, and my wife managed to get photographs of the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis, on her phone. They weren't as clear as the ones that I got with the camera, but you can. Now, on the iPhone, I have an iPhone, so when you are on the screen where the photos are, let me just open mine up. If you scroll down, if you scroll up from the top, you get a load of settings coming up at the bottom of the screen. And there you have the ability to change the exposure and the speed of the photo that you take with an iPhone. So effectively, and I'm not sure whether Samsung and the other manufacturers have this, but I know they do. My first proper digital camera had a 12 megabyte 12 megabyte sensor on it. And the iPhone that I currently have has the same size sensor or capability. It's not the same size sensor, but it has the same capability. So look, these iPhones will have limitations. So again, on the slideshow, you saw a photograph of the lamps on Westminster Bridge with Big Ben in the background. That was taken on an iPhone. There was a photograph of the sunrise. That was in, I'm sorry, I'm name dropping here. It's we recently went to Chile and we were out in the morning, and this sunrise happened with the mountains in the background, that orange, and that was taken from an iPhone, just handheld. And then the other one, I think, was a scene from the Lake District, again, taken from an iPhone. So they are very, very capable, the new smartphones, but you'll just have to fiddle around with your settings in the screen. So like I said to you, if you scroll down or up, another menu comes up at the bottom, and from there you can select your different exposures or different settings.
Thank you. We've had another question come through, which is, do you photograph on full frame sensor or on a digital medium format?
No. So the majority of those photos that you've seen was on a full frame sensor, and it's a 50 megapixel sensor, that particular camera. And I use that predominantly for wildlife. It's a big, heavy thing to carry. I did take it to northern Pakistan last time I went, but I also have, what's happening now are mirrorless cameras are coming in. So the old SLR cameras, they had mirrors, which is why they're so bulky. Now the new ones are coming through, and they're much smaller, but they are just as good. So if I'm out and about on a short holiday or a city break, I don't want to carry this big thing around, because the other problem is it attracts attention. So people either get upset you're taking photographs, or you become a target for potential theft. So I have a much smaller camera that I carry with me as well, which is still about a 25 megapixel sensor on it, but it's very, very discreet, and it's more of a retro style, so people think it's an old camera. But no, I don't have a medium format, because again, medium formats are predominantly used for studio photography. They're not so good for wildlife or fast moving. And so the other thing is, they cost thousands and thousands of pounds. You know, by the time you've bought a body and a lens, you're looking at almost 5 figures. This is a hobby. I'm not a professional, so I'm not willing to spend that sort of money on it.
Thank you. We have one final question, going back to the pictures of the night sky. With the panorama of the night sky, did you move the camera manually? And how did you know how to compose the images? Okay,
so the camera was mounted on a tripod, and the camera was absolutely rock steady on that on the tripod. The only thing that was moving was the actual head, and the objective is, so I used Photoshop to stitch them all together. And you take your first shot and you check it on the back of the camera, see what it looks like. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's called the histogram. I will show that to you in a moment when I start processing a couple of these photographs. So what a histogram shows is whether your photograph is underexposed or overexposed, and by how much. And ideally, you want it to be somewhere in the middle. But obviously, if you're taking a picture in the dark, that histogram is going to be very much to the left. This will become clear when I show you in a moment. So once I'm happy with one test photograph, that, you know, the colors and the exposure is all good and there's no blurriness, then you take one photograph, and then you will move your camera a certain amount in whichever direction you want it to go, so that you still got some of the original photograph in there, because that's how the software will pick up the markers. And then you move across again. So effectively, the first photograph is one, and then I'll move it half a frame across, and then half a frame across, and half a frame across. So each frame has got half of the previous photograph in it, and those are the parameters that software like Photoshop will use to stitch it all together. And then once I've stitched it all together, even though I'm assuming I've got my exposure right, I will still go back and process it in the software again. And the thing with processing, there's no set rule. It's how you want a photograph to look like. That particular one, I could have made it look a little warmer. I could have made it look a little colder. And that's by changing a setting called the white balance. Again, we'll go into that in a moment. So yeah, you have to take multiple photographs, but each frame that you take has to have something of the previous frame in it in order for the software to recognize it. Particularly at night, of a night sky, because there aren't that many distinguishing marks. If you're taking a big panorama of, I don't know, say mountains, then you can pick up peaks as your guidelines. But with the night sky, it's very difficult sometimes to do that. I don't know if anybody has any preference. I've got an elephant, a rhino, and a valley in the northern areas of Pakistan. Any preferences? Which one I start with?
I've had one vote for Valley.
Okay, let's go with that then. So I'm using a software called Lightroom. So it has what's called a develop module. Now, this again is straight out of a camera. I haven't done anything to it. What you see at the top here, that's the histogram. Okay, so as you can see, it's pretty much in the middle. This area on the right side shows those parts of the image that are very bright. So for example, the sky. And then down here, where it's a bit dark, it's showing that. So if I, for example, reduce the exposure, see all the stuff on the right side has gone because there's nothing bright for the histogram to show. And this is just giving you one example. And if I just bring the exposure right up, everything that was dark has gone. So if this was taken straight out of a camera, you've completely overexposed this photograph and vice versa. So if I just reset that. So that's straight out of the camera. Now it's a bit hazy, it's a bit dusty. So what we now want to try and do is improve this photograph. So often what I will do is I'll zoom in and to see what the detail is like. It's quite bright up here, but it's quite dark down here. So, sometimes the first thing I will do is just fiddle around with the exposure. So you can see it's becoming brighter. Now you don't really want to overdo it. Maybe just a little bit, just to bring up some of the shadows from underneath. You then have this contrast button. Again, I'll go from one extreme to the other so you can see what it does. If you reduce the contrast is between different shades. So again, if I go right the way down, you can see it's gone really fuzzy. If I go right to the other end, the contrast between the dark and light areas really becomes very, very prominent. So again, we just want to increase it a little bit just to make it a little more defined. And you can see the sharpness is coming in, the colors are coming in. Now, the next one, if you can see this, is highlights. The highlights are these areas, anything that is very bright. So you can see the sky, you can see the clouds, but they're not very well defined. And this is what I was trying to explain to you earlier. Even though I had set this manually, it was an average. If I had wanted to get the sky in perfect composition, everything down here would have been very dark. So if I now take the highlights down to their minimum, you will see that the clouds have started to become a little more well-defined. It's taking a while. There you go. So the clouds have now just come in. You can see the definition is a little better. We've got some areas down here in the shadows. So again, if I use the shadow slider and go up a bit, it's brought the shadows up. That's all it's done. It hasn't changed the rest of this, because all it's doing is just working on the shadows. So now we've got that detail up a little bit. Again, what we've got here is what's called the whites. Again, it's picking up the whites. So if we go into the whites and we just want to sort of brighten the image a little bit. Again, this is individual. How bright do you want it to go? So it's picked up everything that is bright, and perhaps that's a bit too much. So just bring that down a little bit, because I was losing definition in the mountain areas here. Okay, so that's that. Now, what the blacks will do is anything that is very dark, it'll make it darker. So you can see, again, this has all gone very dark because it was already in the shadows. If we go to the other extreme, it'll brighten anything that's very dark. I'll just leave that as pretty much neutral. Then this particular software, again, has various other factors. So I said to you this was quite hazy. So it has a dehaze button. If I just sort of increase that by about, I don't know, 40, 50, something like that, you'll see in a moment, it's taking a while there. So again, the fuzziness is gone, and all of a sudden, everything's becoming a little clearer. There is what's called here a clarity button. Again, it'll help to make the picture a little sharper. So if we go up, I don't know, maybe about 30, and you'll just wait a while while it kicks in. So immediately, if I go back to that's where we were before. On the left, it's quite fuzzy. And again, on this side, having processed the photograph, it's becoming much, much more appealing. If you want, so if I zoom into that, there's a texture button here. Let me just wait for that to stop whirring. I can increase the overall texture. So I don't know if you can see this on your screens, but all of a sudden, this is becoming very much more well-defined. The problem with increasing the texture in that area is that it also overcooks the image. So I'm just going to bring that down a little bit to maybe about 10. Again, this is an individual thing. There's nothing, and now I've gone negative. So we can leave it at that. Now, I mentioned to you earlier about the white balance. What the white balance does is it's basically to do with the color temperature. When you look at temperatures which are very high, it's going to create a yellow image. So, okay, this was taken around maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If I want to give this an image that perhaps it was taken in the morning, now this is my temperature. Hopefully you can see all of that. So the temperature is effectively creating white balance. So if I bring that temperature down to around 4,000, in a moment it should, there we go. So this looks more like a morning time. And if we go higher up, it's a bit too much. But you'll see what will happen. See, it's completely changed it. So this could be, I don't know, the middle of a day. It's completely changed the whole ambience of the photograph. So if I just go back to somewhere around 5,500, which is a reasonable sort of temperature for that time. There we go, 5,597. So just give it a moment while it kicks in. So it's a little bit more balanced. And then finally, there is a tint that you can apply depending on what it is. So you've got green. Again, I'm going from one extreme to the other. and you'll see it'll change. And you can go up to purple. So somewhere, I would probably say maybe about 19, 20, somewhere like that. It just gives a very different feel to the image. Again, it'll just kick in a minute. So I don't know what you think. I mean, I think it's reasonable in the few minutes I've spent from where we were, which is a very dull looking image, to now we've got something which is a lot more appealing to the eye. So that was just a simple landscape. I think the other ones that I have here, okay, so this is perhaps an interesting one to look at, because now with an animal like this, the first thing I'll do is I might have taken 15, 20 of these shots, and some of them may be rubbish. So the first thing to do is zoom in and see how clear or how sharp it is. So again, hoping you can see the clarity. It's a pretty sharp image. It's all in focus. You can even see where it's had some sort of injury, probably fighting another rhino. So you may decide that this is okay. What I think, it could be better. So this is where I'm now going to crop it a little. Just try and get the perspectives in. I don't want to lose those animals in the background. So again, try and get some sort of balance. This is basically your composition. Again, it's an individual thing. So all of a sudden, it's become a little more prominent. Now, the skin of a rhino is fairly textured. So again, here, I'm going to try and enhance that by increasing the contrast. There are some blacks here. So let's just bring those blacks down a little. And again, I'll zoom in and out of the photograph to see how it is. So again, these areas are quite bright. So possibly you might want to reduce some of the bright areas by reducing the highlight. And if you have a look at the graph at the top of the screen, on the top right, you can see as I'm moving the slider, the graph is also moving. So immediately I've taken this right down, and I've taken the shininess, the brightness out of the scene. Now, you could also reduce the exposure a little bit if you want, but I think it'll become too dark. There you see. So we'll just undo that exposure. Okay. Again, if I zoom into this, you can increase the clarity a little bit. And again, you'll see it'll become sharper once the changes kick in. Again, if we zoom out, it's becoming better. Now, the other thing about this particular photograph, it's quite subdued. So if you want to increase the saturation of the colors, again, most of the software will have this. So you've got the saturation sliders here. Again, you can go over the top with this. So if I just take it up to about 20, 28, you should see all the colors will suddenly become much brighter. So the grass has become yellower, the water's become a little bluer. There's also selective ways of working on this. For example, the blue, if you want to increase the blue of the water, again, I'm going from one extreme to the other, it becomes less luminant. If you go the other direction. So there's a lot of ways of manipulating these photographs. And you don't really have to have a lot of fancy software to do it. Now, the other thing we can do is we can decide we want to go in even tighter. And I always try and keep them slightly off center. Now, because this rhino is facing towards our left, this doesn't look quite right. So what I'll do is I'll have the rhino more towards our right. And that seems to be a bit more balanced because it's at the right, looking at the left. Again, this is to do with composition. Now you can just see the zebra at the back. So perhaps if I just go back into the crop and maybe move this down a little bit, so then you don't cut the zebra off. So you've got the close-up of the rhino, but you've also got the zebras in the background. Now, one more thing you can do with this, because of its texture, convert it to black and white. And again, you'll see how it will change completely. Now, when you look at it, now here you can start playing around with the blacks a little bit. And if we increase the contrast, it's completely changed. So if you don't like it, you can just go back to the color. And again, if we look at before and after, personally, I think what I've done is I've overcooked it. I've overdeveloped it a little. But it's just to show you how far you can take this. And the other thing that is also worth looking at is because we're focusing on this particular subject, if I was just to move that up a little. There is something called vignetting. I'll just go back down and I'll show you what that does. Okay, so you'll see the corners of this image will go slightly darker. And what it tends to do, it leaves the brightness in the center, so your eye is drawn to the rhino or your subject, whatever that might be. So that's another one. I think there was one more.
Naveed, could I ask you, for the novices on the call,
Yes.
when you mentioned that you felt you'd overdeveloped this photo, what sort of things jumped out at you as being overdeveloped?
I increased the saturation, the intensity of the color. And I think it just looks a little unnatural to me personally, because having taken this picture where it was quite dry, it was quite arid. So again, if we look at before and after, the picture is fine as it is. It needs a little bit of enhancing, little bit of tidying up. But I did this just to show how far you can actually go with it. There was a photograph of some zebras, which was a complete black and white picture. Now, I overexposed that picture completely on purpose because it was black and white. I just wanted to pick up the black and whites in there. So in this particular photograph, I've gone from one extreme to the other just to be able to show you. Now, some people may actually like to have these colors vividly represented, and others may want a more subdued look. So you can remove the saturation of the colors. You know, it's a very, very personal thing. If you then present this, I don't know, for example, if you're going to enter in a competition, people who will be looking at it, they will realize that it's been over-processed. That's all it was. I mean, it's not that bad. But also, you see, if you look, for example, let me just get back. Now, if I zoom in on the zebras, you can see they've got color in them, whereas this one's got just black and white. And sometimes the sunlight shining on them and various other factors will make it look unnatural. So that's what I was getting at. This rhino doesn't, it has, what the software will do is it will lift up when you saturate it. Let me just go back and sort of take some of the saturation away. If I come down to maybe 9, just reducing a little bit. You see now the browns and the yellows have become less obvious, but it hasn't lost the effect. And it's possible these zebras might have been just rolling about in the dust, which is why they've picked up all of this stain. So it's an individual thing. You can over-process a photograph so that it actually looks unnatural.
Yeah,
I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. And can I ask you quickly, is this software that you're using free to use or is it paid for?
It's Lightroom. You can download it. It's not free. It's I mean, for those of the people who are students, it's actually very cheap because it's by Adobe, Adobe. They have a multitude of creative softwares for photography, for design, for art. I think I pay about £9 a month for this. But having said that, anyone who has a Mac, there's iPhoto, sorry, not iPhoto, Photos, the Photos program in there. It does everything that I'm doing on this particular software, possibly to a slightly lesser degree, but it has everything on here. So you don't have to go and buy this. And I don't have a Windows machine, so I'm not sure what Windows provide. But I know on Photos, all of this is on there. It may not have every single parameter that you can adjust, but the newer versions, they're pretty good. I think this was last year when I was away. We were sort of following this elephant, and I think he didn't like it, so he suddenly turned towards us. Now, I just managed to get this series of shots. Now, the interesting thing here is, you know, you've got this area here where you've got a dead tree with birds sitting on it, but you can see how much dust the elephant is kicking up. Because this was taken from a car while we were moving, it's not perfectly straight. So again, if we start by looking at this, and this is possible in the free software that you get with the Mac. So it's not straight. You can see that the tree is not 100% straight. So you look at guidelines and you can just start to straighten it up a little bit. Maybe I've probably overdone that a little bit. So just go back. Okay, so that's perhaps a bit better. Now, all of this is of no interest. You know, you've got some bushes there. There's nothing really happening there. So I would get rid of that. I would crop it. Again, this is possible to do in the free version on the Mac. So the elephant is of the interest here. And because it's a little angry, you know, you want to try and capture that. So again, just a few little clicks and it's completely changed the impact of this photograph. Now, there's a lot of dust here. So again, first thing I would perhaps do is maybe increase the exposure a little bit, just make that a little brighter. Let's see how that comes up. Perhaps a bit too much. Okay. When you change the exposure and raise it too much, you will start to lose some of the detail. Now, the sky is not bad, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to try and enhance the clouds a little bit. So again, this comes back to the highlight. If you look at the graph, it's pretty much in the middle. So it's got a good balance of darks and lights. Anything that's too far to one extreme means it's either too bright or too dark. So again, this is something to look at. Now, I'm going to decrease the highlights to try and bring out the clouds. Again, it'll take a while to do this. Take it right down maybe. And also we can enhance that by using the contrast button. So I'm on the contrast button here. This little circle is just telling me it's processing all the changes I'm doing. Sorry, it's taking a while. Okay, now I'd like to increase the dark areas, so I'm just going to reduce the blacks a little bit. So you see now what's happening by reducing the blacks, the haze of the dust is decreasing, but you don't want to lose all of this because that's effectively showing the elephant in motion. And again, we can increase the shadows to try and lift up some of these dark areas. So now again, we come back to these three. These are very, really good adjustment tools, and I think the iPhoto has them as well. So again, I've dehazed it a bit. Now I just want to make this a little sharper. So I've zoomed in, and if we use the clarity button just to increase the sharpness a little bit, again, it'll kick in a moment. So looks a little sharper. I hope that's visible on your screens. If you're not happy with it, you can go back and do a little bit more. So, okay, look, I mean, that's giving an idea. And this one, now, because the elephant is facing towards us, the other thing that you could really do with this, and each time I crop these images, it does reduce the file size, but let's just do this because, again, from that one big photograph, if you really want to go all in, you can get a full close-up of it. And that'll just come in a moment. And convert it to black and white and just add a bit of texture to the surface. And it should bring up all the wrinkles of the skin. There you have it. So it's a bit rough and ready, but at least it gives you an idea of what is possible with all of this.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you so much. You make it look very easy. But yeah, definitely.
It is easy. As we were discussing earlier, I can't draw, I can't paint. Anybody can take a photograph. And the minute they've taken it, it's their piece of art. And then what they choose to do with it, it's up to them. Again, today you've got Instagram, you've got Facebook, you've got this social media, and people are taking photographs with all sorts of cameras, whether it's a smartphone or a big camera. And I think if anything that people take away from this workshop, everyone is capable of taking that perfect photograph, that once in a lifetime shot. And I remember from 4 years back, 5 years back, when I was looking at the gallery, there was such a huge plethora of artwork that was submitted.